Good morning, everybody. Oh, let's try that again. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
All right, that's good. Good morning. Well, my name is Mike Petrilli. I am the president of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, but also a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution, and also an executive editor at Education Next. And on behalf of all three organizations, I am welcoming you to this great debate doubleheader we're having on the feds and school choice. Very much appreciate you being here today on this dreary day in Washington. You know, just a couple of months ago, and I think it was just a few days before the inauguration, we gathered in the same room to talk about school choice and the federal role. Tell me if who was here back then? Anybody? Okay, yep, maybe about a quarter of us. Back then, we talked about some ideas that were floating around that pertain to what the feds could do if they wanted to go big on school choice. There are really three big ideas. One was to take the existing federal money, like Title I, maybe IDEA, and make it portable so that it could follow kids to their school of choice, including private schools. Second big idea was to create a new grant program, federal grant program, maybe something akin to the charter schools grant program, but for private school choice. So if states wanted to do some kind of voucher or tax credit program, they could apply for federal funds for that. And then finally, doing something through the tax code. And the idea that really we talked most about was this notion of a federal tax credit scholarship program. That if an individual or a corporation donated to an organization that makes K-12 scholarships or vouchers, that they would get not only a deduction on their taxes, they'd get a credit. And that maybe that would be the way to go big on school choice and meet this target that candidate Trump talked about on the campaign trail, about $20 billion for school choice. Well, since then, some things have happened. The real world has intervened, and some events have transpired. Namely, the president came out with his skinny budget. And I would argue two of the three ideas that I just mentioned are in that skinny budget. And the one that's not is the one that we're talking about here today. He said in his budget that he wanted to put $1 billion of new money into Title I, but with the goal of making that money somehow encourage weighted student funding, so kind of portability. Details to follow. Also proposed a new $250 million private school choice grant program. Again, details to follow. What he did not propose was any kind of big federal tax credit program. But what we keep hearing is that that is because that is to be part of a tax reform proposal yet to be released. Maybe to be released tomorrow, we hear. You know, we reached out to the president and said, hey, if you want to make your announcement right here, you know, that would be great. But for some reason, I don't know, that they never got back to us about that. Yeah, I should have done it by Twitter. You're right. So here we are talking about this one thing he hasn't proposed yet. Well, why is that? It's because we continue to hear from people close to Secretary DeVos and kind of scuttlebutt around town that they are working on some big tax credit proposal as a part of the tax reform bill. Because it's our understanding that that is still a work in progress, we're hoping that we might still have some ability to influence what that looks like. So that brings us to today. Two big debates. The first debate is, should we even do this? Is this a good idea for the federal government to get involved in this issue? Assuming you support vouchers, you buy the basic idea that it's a good thing to give kids choices, including private and religious schools, is this something we want the federal government doing? Or, frankly, will the Fed screw this up like they've screwed up almost everything else? That is the subject of our first debate that we're having. And then the second debate is, if we do a tax credit program, should it be something where we go big, we go national, it's something 50 states, every kid in the country, maybe every low-income kid in the country could apply. This could have an impact in New York City and Los Angeles and Chicago, not just in red states that are likely to pass some kind of voucher or tax credit bill. Should we go 50 state? Or should it be something that really defers to states that states have to opt into and that states then set the rules for? And that's the second debate. So get ready for this doubleheader. We'll have a very brief switcheroo in the middle. But without further ado, let me introduce our first moderator, my colleague at Education Next, Marty West, also a professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Marty took over as editor-in-chief of EdNext just last summer.
That's right.
And it continues to be a great publication. And Marty's going to take us away with this first debate. Marty.
Excellent. Thanks, Mike, for the introduction. Thanks for co-sponsoring this event with us at Education Next. Thanks to Hoover for hosting us in this beautiful facility. I'm excited to have the opportunity to moderate this first debate because I really think it's a fascinating opportunity to consider the relationship between two long-standing conservative priorities for American education policy. Of course, those would be reducing the federal footprint, both in terms of finances and in terms of regulations on American public schools. The second priority being expanding parental choice, including the opportunity to attend a private school with government support. These are ideas that conservatives have generally favored over the past couple of decades. And as a candidate, Donald Trump certainly sounded both of those themes. And with his appointment of Secretary Betsy DeVos as Secretary of Education, he clearly signaled his intention to follow through on the latter. Of course, the big question is whether those ideas are really compatible. Can they be reconciled? And that's what I think we have the opportunity to think through in this first debate, where we're asking the basic question, is the idea of the federal government offering a tax credit to subsidize scholarships that would allow families to attend private schools really a good idea? Is there a role for Uncle Sam in this, or will the feds inevitably screw it up? Joining me to debate that question are Tom Carroll and Neil McCluskey. Tom will be arguing in favor of a federal initiative in this area. He's the president of the Foundation for Opportunity in Education based in Albany, New York. He's played a key role in the development of education policy in New York State as an analyst and advisor in the state legislature. He played a key role in particular in the adoption of charter school laws, of legislation in that state. And more recently, he's been an advocate at the state level for the creation of a tuition tax credit scholarship program of the type that we're discussing here today. To his left is Neil McCluskey, who will be arguing against federal involvement. He's the director of the Cato Institute Center for Educational Freedom. Before that, he was a high school English teacher and also served in the U.S. Army. He's the author of an important book, Feds in the Classroom, How Big Government Corrupts, Cripples, and Compromises American Education. If you have any questions about what the thesis of that book is, maybe we can ask him. But he will be prepared to make the negative case. I'm going to give each of them about 10 minutes to lay out their initial positions, 5 minutes then to respond to what they've heard, and then I'll begin asking them some questions before we open it up to the audience. So thanks for being here, and without further ado, Tom, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you. First of all, let me describe what I think the opportunity is. You have what I view as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to get something very bold done on school choice, something that applies to all 50 states. You obviously have Republican control of both houses, which I'm not making a partisan point, but given how the Betsy DeVos nomination went down, we kind of know what Democratic control of both houses would look like on school choice issues. And you have a president, although unique in many ways, to say the least. The one most important characteristic for this debate is he clearly does not give a moment's thought to what the teachers union thinks on any educational issue. That has not been true of any president of either party for a long time. So lots of things suddenly become possible because the political environment is so dramatically different. So the question before us then is, do we go big or do we go small? Assuming that the people in this room, including the panelists, actually have the ability to decide that question. So a number of people have argued, and I think Neil's essential argument is that we should do nothing. Heritage has argued that we should do something, but basically what I've called, and Peter Murphy is in the audience, called kind of a small potatoes approach, that we do a couple micro proposals along the way, whether it's DC scholarships, military scholarships, something that involves the Bureau of Indian Affairs and so forth, all of which I don't have. I'm kind of an all of the above school choice person, so I don't have a problem with any of those. But the question is that really, are those proposals right-sized for the size of the political opportunity before us? because we have a window here that's going to close at some point, and once it closes, it literally may never be seen again in our lifetime. So from my perspective, I vote for going big, not going small, and certainly I vote against doing nothing. Now, details matter a lot. When you say we should do something, we go big. The specific thing that I propose is, first, I think we should do something on the tax side versus something on the spending side. And part of the reason for that is, for reasons that Neil will soon articulate, is virtually every spending initiative that's been done has, whether at the state level or at the federal level, has been tied with tremendous number of federal restrictions and really has opened the door to all kinds of what I would call nanny state regulations. The history on the tax side, although not perfect, has been, by comparison, much more free of regulations. Then if you're going to do something on the tax side, my own preference is to do something that would, as we've been trying to do in New York, and as 17 states have done so far, notably Arizona, Florida, Pennsylvania, a few other key states, Indiana, where the vice president's from, is to do a tax credit that encourages more charitable donations to nonprofit scholarship funds. The idea is really simple. Right now, there's a charitable deduction that encourages, among lots of charitable purposes, that people give to scholarship organizations, including K-12 scholarship organizations. We just simply want to ratchet up the percent value of that tax benefit. So whether you're, whatever tax rate you're paying at, you're paying 35 or 38% or whatever, that would go up to 100% because you'd get a dollar for dollar tax credit. That's what we're in favor of. Obviously, we think educational is a foundational issue in the country. Almost every other issue relates to whether you get the education piece right for children at a young age. It affects almost every other area of public life and private life, and obviously every other area of the federal budget, one way or the other. So we would make it kind of first among equals and give it this special status by giving a tax credit for people who donate philanthropically to nonprofit scholarship funds. We would do it in terms of details, all 50 states. There's not a lot of precedent for having federal tax code vary by state. And so I think it naturally flows that if you did a federal tax credit, it would apply to all 50 states. We're in favor of a clean bill. Neil probably would agree that if you were to do a bill, he doesn't agree on doing a bill, but if you were to do one, he would be in favor of the least amount of regulation and the least amount of damage. We agree on that. So that means in a couple of respects, one, that nothing should be included in the bill that impairs religious liberty. Nothing should be included in the bill that, in my view, that reduces the autonomy of individual schools. I've seen kind of the creep of bureaucracy on the charter school front, having been there at inception for when we have one of the strongest charter school laws in the country in New York. And even from people that I would consider friends, the temptation to regulate and regulate and regulate kind of creeps up over time. So I think it's important to get it right on the front end. I also believe that it's important that it not only help the economically disadvantaged, but that it also help middle-class families who, depending on where they live, face many of the same challenges in being able to afford and exercise choice and could benefit from scholarships as well, depending on whatever local scholarship organizations decided. So the two big objections are, one, the federal government doesn't have authority to do anything in the sphere of education. Neil can articulate that more than I can. It seems obvious to me that since the 1960s, but particularly since the creation of the Education Department, that issue has already been established, that, and it's not successfully been challenged by anybody constitutionally. If you think of Title I, IDEA, the mere existence of the Federal Department of Education, whether you like it or not or think it's a good idea to have any of those programs, there's no doubt that the federal government has a big footprint, and there's no doubt from a constitutional perspective that it has the authority to do all those things. Witness the mere fact that nobody's been able to stop it in the courts in 30, 40, 50 years. The second thing is that bad things will happen in the future. This is something that I'm an Irish optimist, but I agree with Neil that bad things will happen in the future. I happen to think that bad things will happen in the future whether a scholarship tax credit bill happens or not. All you have to do is look back at the Obama administration and look at the attempts at regulatory overreach to believe, to understand that if a certain type of administration got elected, that they would try to do a lot of things that Neil and I would disagree with. And the fact that they were able to contemplate all those things without the scholarship tax credit even being seriously considered in the last 8 years suggests that that's an ever-present threat that I would suggest all of us should spend a lot of time reflecting on how we could defeat that in whatever form it comes. But I don't think it's unique to this particular issue. I don't think the stakes are higher or lower. I think that's a broader cultural issue in which there's a very, very strong fight, particularly against religious institutions. There's a natural tendency of all government agencies to want to micromanage any private institution, whether it's corporate or nonprofit. And those are things that we have to be ever vigilant on, regardless. So I think we would agree on that. So in conclusion, I would say I think it's important to seize the opportunity that what we all should do is get together, and if the bill does start moving forward, and we frankly don't know whether Trump will actually move it forward, but Mike is right. The kind of the scuttlebutt, the word on the street is that this is going to be given serious consideration. And if that is the case and the bill is put out there, then I think we should all work together to try to make sure that it's the best bill possible in terms of expanding school choice and ensuring the participation of religious institutions, the freedom of parents, the autonomy of schools, and in a way that we can get the best possible outcome. And understand, as we did in New York when we did the charter school law, we knew that the teachers' unions were never leaving planet Earth. They'll be here, you know. I joke after a nuclear attack, the only thing left will be cockroaches in the teachers' unions. So I think you have to understand that they're playing a very, I say that actually with admiration. They're playing, like, I used to have great admiration for Ted Kennedy, although I did not agree with him on a lot of issues, because over his lifetime, he had a goal in mind, he knew what it was, and he just, every day of the week, he moved his agenda forward. And towards the end of his life, one of the things that he wanted was healthcare reform. He ended up getting it because of that constancy of vision. I think on the school choice side, we have to have the same kind of commitment to waging this battle over a very long time. One, so that we prevail on the behalf of children, and two, so that Neil's nightmare doesn't come true. Because I agree, I don't want the nightmare that Neil outlines to come true either, and I think we have to all work together to make sure that it doesn't happen. Thank you.
Neil, what is that nightmare?
Well, my first nightmare is that you'll admire me, and I don't know what you'll end up, you'll call me the plague or something. But I guess I get the role of the Irish pessimist in this. But I want to start actually by thanking Hoover and Education Next and Fordham all for putting this together and inviting me, and also for the debate we got to have on Education Next, which I thought was really interesting. I do, though, have a complaint about today's event, which is it's very much slanted against me. I mean, think about what the second panel is. It's essentially, well, we know Neil's going to lose, so now let's talk about how we set this thing up. But that's okay. I can handle that. You know, if you know sports, you know that it's kind of good to be the underdog, because they're always, the announcer, like, there's no pressure on him, because that guy's going to lose anyway, probably. It's the guy who isn't the underdog who has all the pressure on him. So, are you feeling it?
I feel your pain.
All right. You're going to feel more pressure in a second, I guarantee. Okay, so now that I have set myself up where I can't lose, let's talk about why not federal choice. I mean, I like school choice. I think we've decided, many of the people, most of the people probably in this room like school choice. Why not kind of go big or go home, especially when we have this political window of opportunity to do it? But I think there are numerous reasons that we do not want to go down this road. Let's not be enticed by this shiny object. I'm going to go through 6 of them. There are probably more. I could expand on all of them, but we'll try and get them real fast because we've got more debate to go. Obviously, the first one, as Tom has talked about, is this is my nightmare, which is that you have federal control ultimately of ostensibly private institutions, that we kind of render choice much less meaningful because we're getting it through a mechanism where, yeah, we can choose a school, but that school isn't allowed to be much different from the public schools that we're trying to move away from. And yes, absolutely, a voucher is a more dangerous way to do this. If the money comes directly through government, we've seen the research. Andrew Coulson, my former boss, had done much of this research. We know that the vouchers tend to be more regulated than tax credits. But we need to be very clear that regulations come with tax credits, and we can look at higher education to see this. If you want to claim a federal tax credit for higher education, you must go to an institution that is accredited. And the federal government, not only does it have sort of direct regulation of schools if you take this federal money, and almost every school in America takes it, almost every college, but they also regulate accreditors. And they say, accreditors, since you're sort of the gatekeepers for this student aid, including tax credits, you say, well, you know, every school has to have a million volumes or more in the library, and you have to have this and that and the other thing. And that is also part of these tax credits. They, through accreditation, regulate the schools to make them look very much the same. This is why we talk about there is such limited innovation in higher education. It is through accreditation, and the federal government says, we're not going to regulate you schools on everything. We'll regulate a lot. We'll regulate the accreditors, tell them what they have to demand of you. And so essentially you have federal control of higher education. And tax credits are one way this is done. And I think that if you were to have, even not in some initial proposal that came from the Trump administration, if you didn't see something that said, well, okay, if you claim a credit for going to a K through 12 school, that school has to be accredited. The first time or the second time you see maybe a scholarship granting organization, if we're talking about donation credits. If a scholarship granting organization lets someone take money to a school that doesn't do well, maybe it just gets bad math scores, or worse, they have a discriminatory policy of some type, or somebody absconds with money, you'll quickly see the regulations, if they aren't there to begin with, added to it, because that's how politics often works. All you need is anecdotal evidence to say, ooh, something bad was done with this tax credit, which we, the federal government, have created. Now we have to regulate it so that bad things don't happen. So the next thing then is federalism is really important. Suppose that the idea that we should have a serious federal role in providing money for people to choose colleges, to go to K through 12 schools, suppose that really explodes. I mean, that really takes off. We can look at higher education actually to see that having happened. If you go back 40 or 50 years ago, there wasn't a whole lot of federal student aid for higher education. But as soon as you have some, the people who aren't getting it say, well, we need some. You have colleges start to raise their prices because frankly, the money is there for them to get. Then you have more people who need aid because, well, now the price has gone up, and you get this vicious cycle where you have dependence now on federal education money, essentially federal vouchers, federal tax credits, federal loans. And so there's a very good chance that even if we start small, it becomes much bigger. Then what you have is essentially the federal government crowding out states, saying we'll now be the primary funder of students. It won't be that you have your voucher program in this state and you have an ESA program over here. It's everyone will go to the federal government. You've now pushed states out of the way. You have essentially destroyed federalism. And then you lose all the benefits that go with federalism. You lose protection from failure when a policy doesn't work out. I mean, this is what laboratories of democracy are about, right? One state can try something. If it doesn't work, it doesn't drag down all the other states. If it does, states can try those things. They can change them so that they are consistent with the culture of that state or the politics of that state. We get protected from bad policies, and we get these laboratories of innovation. We can say goodbye to those things. And if you think about the school choice movement, 10 years ago, people weren't thinking about education savings accounts. A state had to try that, and people said, hey, look, that's a good idea. That's the sort of innovation you get when you have federalism. If you have the federal government become the primary funder of school choice, you lose that, and it's extremely important. Then we have the Constitution, and you're right, absolutely. The Constitution has been sort of shunted aside in education the last 50 years. And so is though the right argument, well, we already violate that thing. I mean, who cares about the Constitution? If we really want something, if it's something good, if it's school choice, then we should say, okay, we'll go along with what we thought has been wrong all along because it gives us something we want. I can't really do that. One, because if I go and make an argument about, look, these federal policies in education aren't working, and by the way, there's no specific enumerated power that gives you any control over education. How can I make that argument and then turn around and say, well, except for school choice, because, well, I like that, school choice is good. The Constitution has to matter, that there are specific enumerated powers, and that's it, has to matter. And if we're going to make that argument, if we're going to stop the federal government from doing all sorts of things in education that I think clearly are not working, and we're going to say, by the way, part of this is based on the rule of law, then we can't say, but we're going to push the rule of law aside for something that we like. And I should also say, sort of snarky, but by the way, if you want Elizabeth Warren, Secretary of Education, making the decisions for all private schools, go ahead, then let's have more federal school choice. Anyway, the next three are shorter, and I know I'm running out of time, so they have to be shorter. But these are sort of secondary, but still actually really important when we think about it. And we shouldn't make policy with a narrow focus only on, well, we do education, we do school choice, and nothing else matters. The tax code. Anybody familiar with the tax code? Anybody do your taxes lately? April 15th or 17th, whenever they were due. Not that long ago. The tax code is sort of an efficiency-destroying, special interest coddling, taxpayer befuddling, sort of social engineering disaster. I mean, does anybody understand what all the loopholes are, everything, how it works? I mean, the federal government could probably audit almost anybody and find something wrong, in part because the tax code is incredibly complicated. If you add another tax credit, you only make it more complicated. And I certainly understand that we say, well, it's already extremely complicated. This is just one little thing relative to all that complication. It's for something really good. It's for school choice. But remember, everybody is saying, I just want my little thing. But when everybody says, I just want my little thing, suddenly you have a giant, atrocious thing that nobody can work with. And we shouldn't be adding to that. Then there's, I think, a political problem with calling for federal school choice. It wasn't that long ago we were doing school choice, and we didn't see a big national backlash against the idea of school choice, of having people choose private schools. Certainly there was a debate, and it was ongoing, but it seems to me at least that ramped up significantly in the last, well, since roughly January. And you have both the media writing more about it, often negative stories, and you have sort of policy people who would kind of let it go, now thinking, boy, I better pay more attention to school choice. And so many of you saw what Kevin Carey wrote in the New York Times several months ago. He wasn't thinking much about private school choice before that. And it's not a secret, I don't think. I saw it on Twitter where he's saying, hey, I haven't been paying much attention to this. Somebody, please, tell me what the research says. And he went to Marty West, the right guy, to ask about the research. But it's an illustration that there were a lot of people who weren't paying attention. And then if you read his article, you could see that this was intended, I think, or at least that's how it appeared, to be, I'm going to say school choice doesn't work, and I'm just going to, base it on some recent studies without really getting into what's specific about it. One study that hasn't been published. But the point isn't necessarily that the critiques that we're seeing against school choice are necessarily valid or that they're right. It's that they are there. And now we're having to fight a much bigger, much more national debate, which requires a lot more resources, a lot more time. And I think we're going to see a lot more just sort of quote-unquote straight media stories that are very negative. Is this ultimately going to be good politically for the cause of school choice? And I will say, whether you like Trump or not, I'm not sure the association with the Trump administration is politically positive. Finally, I'd say we also have to recognize that states have been succeeding at this. 30 years ago, there were essentially no modern private school choice programs. There were no charter schools. This year, there are, at least as last I counted in 2017, there were 61 private school choice programs around the country. They enroll about 450,000 students. Now, I know that's not nearly as big as we would like, but that's huge progress. And we're actually at the point where nobody goes around. You don't have candidates for a major office. Even when President Obama was candidate Obama, he said, of course people should have a say in where their kids go to school. That is huge progress. And I don't think that we should jeopardize that either with regulatory controls or maybe even a political disaster when we see so much progress already being made at the state level where constitutionally it should be made. And so now I've kind of laid out my case, and so my question to especially the organizers is it too late to change the topic of the second pencil to, Neil totally convinced us, no, maybe not. Did you organize it? No, so where's Mike Petrilli? You could change it to Neil totally convinced us that federal school choice is a terrible idea, but we should do something about how we just dismantle the whole federal education operation.
Tom, you now have a very important responsibility, which is to save the second panel. Neil's laid out a parade of horribles. I'd invite you to respond for 5 minutes, however you like, but one of the things I want to make sure that you address is this concern that even if you get what you refer to as a clean bill initially, that inevitably this will not look so clean under a new administration. And, in your remarks, you sort of said you're worried about regulation regardless, but, wouldn't this open up private schools to federal oversight in a way that wouldn't be the case otherwise? So,
okay, let me try to respond to those 18 points in 5 minutes. And I'll do that by grouping. First, on the constitutional issue, it keeps getting asserted with no proof that it's unconstitutional at all. You've had a very long time to win a court case dismantling all the federal funding that exists now and the U.S. Department of Education, and Cato's never been able to win that court case. So I'm looking forward to see how that works out. Second thing is, even under the U.S. Constitution, no matter how you read it, the federal government has always had the power to tax under any configuration in a federal system. And part of the power to tax is to decide what they're taxing and how much they're taxing it. So that's not constantly, I don't see how anybody would argue that's constitutionally suspect. Third, Article 10 doesn't say all the powers that aren't enumerated specifically for the federal government revert to the state. It says the state or the people. So what our plan does is essentially drive philanthropy down. It's private individuals making donations to private nonprofits who then will get applications from private parents to give money to private individuals called children. That is driving it down to the people, not making all of those decisions made by the federal government or the state government. And I know you're fascinated with state governments, but I will invite you to New York to experience a state government that is just as out of control as the federal government. So I would prefer following the doctrine of subsidiarity, which has its roots in Catholic social teaching, of driving it even further down, because I don't trust federal politicians or state politicians. So let me make that point. The question of does the federal government have a new nexus? First of all, the federal government already has indicated, first of all, private schools do get federal money. Not all private schools take it, but a lot of private schools get federal money. So they already have the nexus, and they've already opined on all kinds of issues. And I have no doubt if Elizabeth Warren becomes Secretary of Education, even if the scholarship tax credit's not approved, she will try to do whatever she's going to try to do. And so I think all of us have to gird for that battle. And that's why I think this is a long battle. So when we did the charter school law in New York, on my theory that the unions are never going away, I collected all the donors that were behind the effort and said, look, this is a long-term battle. Like, we're going to be fighting the teachers' unions on this issue forever. And we have to roll up our sleeves. There's no way around it. And they're coming for us, and they're going to try to regulate the hell out of everything. And we have to organize for that coming. And I think we have to organize that even if the scholarship tax credit is not proposed or approved. So I don't think that really changes it that much at all. You have the view that in a nation of 350 million people, that 450,000 people in all these private school choice programs that have come into being over the last 2 decades is enough progress that we should allow that trajectory, which roughly goes like this instead of like this. And if you're a mom or a dad with a kid about to enter preschool or kindergarten next year, the thought that you would just sit there and wait and wait and wait and wait, because on that trajectory, that kid will get a scholarship roughly in the year 3027. At that point, we'll all be dead, unless, you know, we do the cryogenics or whatever we do to come back to have this debate again in another 100 years. But it simply isn't an answer for those families. So we think we have an answer that will give, if it's passed this year, scholarships will go out next year. Literally millions of kids could get scholarships. I don't agree that it's constitutionally suspect at all. And I understand that we have to do it right. And if a proposal ends up being the wrong proposal, I'll be standing next to Neil, screaming just as loud to try to kill the proposal. I'm not in favor of any tax credit at any cost. I'm in favor of a very particular approach to doing this that I think is a very clean approach. And if it ends up that in the politics of the swamp of DC, that a clean approach is not possible, then I'm no longer with it. And I will do as much as Neil, maybe even more, to try to stop a bad bill from happening. So I'm an optimist. I think there's an opportunity, but I'm also a realist. I understand things can go wrong. I'm willing to prepare for the future, and I'm willing to switch sides if this ends up not being the clean bill that I favor.
Neil, Tom questions your, I guess, the pragmatism behind your arguments about the constitutionality of the federal role in education. Given that there is a federal role, despite those arguments, why not try and take advantage of it to advance a goal that you say you endorse?
Yeah, well, I think what Tom said really gets it, which is if a clean approach is not possible, you won't support it. And I'm here to tell you a clean approach is not possible. Even if it starts clean, we can look at even federal tax credits in higher education and say rules and regulations will eventually be attached to these things. And we can see how this happens in school choice, lots of other programs. All you need is a few anecdotes, especially high-profile anecdotes of something going wrong, and what is in the incentive, the best interest of a politician in Washington is to say, well, we're going to add regulations so that we can send the message we don't tolerate this, even if we don't think those regulations necessarily work, even if we think they have huge unintended consequences. What benefits us is to say, we're going to keep this from happening. And since the teachers' unions aren't going away, the teachers' unions are a great driver of this sort of thing, saying we got a whole lot of people who are going to talk a whole lot to a lot of other people a lot of the time about this bad thing that happened in school choice. And so they'll be driving the regulation. If we don't think they're going to go away, we know that we have 3 or 4 or 4.5 million union members who are going to try their hardest to say, well, let's regulate these private schools. Not to mention the fact that there are a lot of people who have a lot of reservations about any money going to a religious institution. And I can almost guarantee there will be regulations about what a religious institution can do, at least in terms of admissions. And there'll be people who are saying, well, here are things you're not allowed to teach because we think that they may discriminate or they may be inaccurate. And totally understandable why that is, because people say, well, okay, even if it's not a voucher, and absolutely vouchers are more dangerous than tax credits, but even if it's not a voucher, they say, well, look, this is money that never goes to government that would have been used on the public schools, which is being diverted. We can't let it be diverted to something that teaches creationism. You know, that's probably the one that comes to mind most. But it could be all sorts of other things that people say, well, this is beyond the pale. You can't teach whole language, or you can't teach phonics, or you can't teach whatever because we think that that doesn't work. So is a clean approach possible? I'm not sure it'll start that way. I'm pretty sure it certainly won't be clean after it's been around for a while. I also would note that, well, in terms of the constitutionality, I think that certainly what we can see historically is that courts change their minds, which is why the federal government is involved in education. Switch in Time Staves 9 is when we decided that instead of saying the federal government was constrained to specific enumerated powers, that it can do anything. And by the way, the tax provision and the general welfare clause, tax clause, general welfare clause, if you read the Federalist, It says very clearly that is in service of the specific enumerated clause. It does not mean that you can tax or give tax credits for whatever purpose the federal government wants. The whole idea of a federal government was to be constrained to specific things, and then, like you said, everything else is left to the states or the people. And I'd also say within government, subsidiarity means not having the federal government say, we will try and engineer something. And that is sort of what school choice is. It's actually taking us away from a monopoly toward more freedom. I actually absolutely think that's right. But within systems of government, it's clear that this tax credit is saying, well, we're trying to give more school choice. The question then is the subsidiary, the federal government should say, we're going to bypass the states and local governments and go right to the people, but oh, by the way, we're going to put lots of regulations on these things? Or do we say, it's not our job, the Constitution doesn't say it's our job, and even though states often make bad decisions, and they're, I'm from New Jersey, so I know what bad government looks like, even though they make bad decisions, is it better that we have lower levels of government do this? And oh, by the way, at least we're not imposing New York's government on everybody, and Arizona can still do good stuff because they're not New York? Or do we say, well, let's just have one central government kind of make these decisions because we don't like what states have done?
So, Tom, I want to actually return to a point you made at the very opening of your remarks, which was about the need to take advantage of the moment politically. And, you know, one other recent development or aspect of the current moment is that we've just seen results from a handful of statewide voucher or scholarship programs that have been enacted by the states in recent years. And the early results from evaluations of those programs have been actually quite mixed, in some cases suggesting actually large negative effects on the math and reading achievement of students initially transferring from public to private schools. Given that, why is now the right time to actually create a universal nationwide program that would operate in all 50 states? Don't we actually need to figure out how to make this work?
Yeah, so part of it is what your view of accountability is. So there's different accountability structures in regular public schools, in public charter schools, and in private schools. I don't think that the accountability regime in public or charter schools should be applied to private schools, or that they should be measured in the same way, because private schools are chosen for a lot of different reasons. And I haven't yet met a private school parent who chose a private school because of standardized test scores, or because of evaluations, or whether the school was accredited, or anything like that. Some people are doing it as a matter of faith. Some people are doing it for safety reasons. Some people are doing it because they think the school does a better job at instilling character and virtue. Some people do it because they want a single gender option for their child, which is more prevalent, not exclusively in the private market, but it's more prevalent in the private school market. So in one of the reasons that Race for the Top and Common Core blew up in people's faces is because there was a disconnect between what policy elites valued and what parents valued, and the unions took advantage of it, which is kind of all the chattering class believes that test scores are the be-all and end-all, and the parents simply don't. And so when you got to a situation, which was coercion on Race for the Top and Common Core, started voluntary, but then became a coercive thing, parents wanted nothing to do with it. So you have in New York, you have a massive testing, or what is it, Peter, like over 20% of the parents have opted out of standardized testing in regular public schools. So I would, myself, I'm more libertarian on this issue than other people may be in the room, is I would let parents actually choose which schools they wanted to go to, whether anybody who studies private schools agrees that that school's a good school or not. So I would prefer there be more good schools than bad schools, but I'm also not willing to substitute my judgment for the judgment of a parent living in a particular neighborhood, assessing what the options are, knowing that the accountability regimes, particularly with public schools, has not produced higher quality public schools. So I'm not confident that applying that to the private school market would lead to different outcomes and results.
So Neil, we heard you offer a very different characterization than Tom of the amount of progress that private school choice has made in the states. You talked about 61 programs. Tom, you talked about the number of students who are attending a private school with a subsidy from one of those programs, and it's well less than 1% of K-12 children nationally. So given that actually limited scope of these programs over really a couple of decades of pushing for them, why not try and use the federal government to sort of increase that pace? And in order to sort of, I don't know, make the case for that, let me try out an argument that libertarians may find more attractive. Many libertarians accept that government, and the federal government in particular, has a role to play in breaking up monopolies in the private economy. Wouldn't a federal school choice program, in effect, serve much the same purpose, giving consumers options beyond those operated by, those offered by 14,000 geographically defined local monopolies that currently provide public education in the U.S.?
All right, so I guess I'll start with your first one, because I'm still writing my note for that, so I won't forget it. In terms of breaking up monopoly, it's an interesting way of looking at it. I think, though, that it would be much more beneficial if, instead of focusing on a federal school choice program, if we want to do something at the federal level to break up a monopoly, we start to dismantle the federal Department of Education and the things that it does, because the vast majority of what it does is about propping up these monopoly systems. And so I don't see actually that a tax credit would destroy, a federal tax credit would destroy these monopoly systems, but I do see a very real and present danger that a federal tax credit would become a vehicle for making private schools much more like the public schools that we are trying to give people options to get away from. And it's, by the way, I loved everything you just said about, about the Common Core and letting the accountability be to the kids, so, I mean, to the families. So I wish we weren't debating. I wish we could agree on that. But, I mean, agree on everything else. We definitely agree on that. But think about the Common Core for a second. Imagine that we had some sort of federal tax credit that had regulations attached to it, as we see in higher education. Regulations get attached to tax credits. And we had the push for Common Core. You could very easily have seen the federal government say, look, you want to use a tax credit? It has to be at a private school that uses the Common Core, or the euphemism they use for Common Core, which is college and career standards common to a majority of states. In other words, we weren't that far off if we had had school choice from the federal government. Instead of breaking up a monopoly, said, here, use these monopoly standards, which will drive your curriculum so that private schools look a whole lot more like public schools. So I don't think that, I think that the main federal threat to monopoly is almost everything it does in education actually supports the monopoly, and that to go to some sort of tax credit or other vehicle for school choice would just sort of spread monopolistic things like a single set of standards to every school in the country. And let's be clear, yes, private schools could say, well, we're not going to participate, but does that happen in higher education? In higher education, you've got Hillsdale, Grove City, and like 2 others, and everybody else says we've got to take students with the student aid and all the regulations, because otherwise we can't compete with those other schools that do it and supply all sorts of things that, students really like, right up to the climbing walls, and my favorite, which is you can go to several colleges and they literally have water parks. Now, I'm not saying that that's the threat of tax credits to private schools, that they'll suddenly all have to have water parks, but you can see that'd be nice.
Lazy River, I always enjoy that.
Yeah, or, just a nicer natatorium. In any event, the point is we can look at higher education and see the dangers that I'm talking about actually working.
So I want to open it up to the audience in just a minute, but Tom, one last question for you before we do so. Am I right to think that a substantial federal tax credit program to expand school choice would, in effect, amount to a massive centralization of education spending to the federal level? I hear you actually talking about a type of program that would not be capped at $20 billion, but even if there were some sort of cap on the number of credits that could be claimed, this would transfer a lot of funding up to the federal level. Why is that something that conservatives should support? Why is that something they should be comfortable with? And wouldn't it just make it harder to accomplish some of the other goals of tax reform, like simplifying the tax code and reducing rates of taxation on individual and corporate income, without blowing up the federal deficit.
Okay, so first of all, if you're making the argument, or someone's making the argument that it leads to centralized spending, there are two words there. One, centralized. It's not centralized at all. You're talking about tens of millions or 100 million taxpayers around the country that will make individual decisions on whether they want to take a tax credit. They then will decide out of tens of thousands of scholarship organizations that they might donate to, and literally millions of parents will make independent decisions. So that's decentralized, not centralized. In terms of the spending, it's not spending. It is, you're talking about backing off on taxes so people have more of their own private money to donate for charitable purposes. It's the Supreme Court in the Arizona tuition case, which upheld Arizona's state scholarship tax credit program, basically argued that everything involved in this transaction is not government money, which is why they denied standing in the case. It's private money going to private nonprofits, going to private families to make individual private decisions. There's no government money involved whatsoever. The only way you can call it government money is if you assume that all of private wealth belongs to the government, and so anything that they decide to do with your private wealth constitutes spending. I don't accept that from a philosophical perspective. It's individual people spending the money that they earned in the first place, and the government is just simply stepping back and taking less money. So now the other issue I'd say on the states, just quickly, is nothing we're talking about stops the states, all of which have their own state tax codes, from doing whatever they want on school choice or scholarship tax credits, whether they want to have them or not. It's totally up to them. So all the state experimentation that Neil wants, that I like, can continue. The two tax codes are independent, and everybody's free to do whatever they want with their own tax codes.
So let's open it up to the audience. Please wait for the microphone and be sure to identify yourself and make sure that your question ends with a question mark.
Hi, I'm Chris Tassoni from 50 Can, and I have a question with a question mark. If we're in a moment where there is strong support for school choice, are we missing an opportunity by focusing on the federal level to build really robust, stronger programs serving millions of kids in 15 or 10 or 5 states? And if, in fact, the strength behind this is only among elites at the federal level and there is not that support in the states, are we setting ourselves up for backlash against a fragile federal program similar to the backlash against federal support for Common Core?
So first of all, if you want to focus on 15 or 20 states, what you're saying is you're basically writing off the rest of the country and all the children who live in the rest of the country. Personally, I'm not excited about that prospect. And the reason some states don't have it, like New York, for example, or New Jersey, or Connecticut, or Illinois, or California, or whatever, is not because there isn't support. The reason they're not having it is just because, frankly, the teachers' unions have a stranglehold on the political class in those states. It has nothing to do with whether moms in the South Bronx or in Harlem or Chicago, south side of Chicago, support school choice or not. The answer is they do. Would they like to get money to give them greater choices? I don't think I've ever met a parent who didn't have money, who wouldn't want money to exercise greater choices for their children. So that's not in question. The magic moment here is not that the overall level of support for school choice has changed among the general population. What's changed is the people who are running the government here are not beholden to the teachers union. In New York, the teachers unions give money to both sides of the aisle. They figured out you can buy a Republican for about 5 cents more than a Democrat. Okay, so that's kind of an economic insight they have. At the federal level, they stupidly have given 95% of their money to one side. And that's great for them when the Democrats are in control, but when the Republicans are in control, the Republicans, frankly, don't care much what the teachers union have to say because they're totally on the Democratic side. Not that they should be, but that's the strategic mistake that they made. So that's the opportunity now, is you have a bunch of elected officials that will consider things on the merits without the coercion, excess coercion from this one dominant special interest. And you have a president who is, in part because of his wealth, in part because of his personality, is blithely indifferent to what the teachers unions think on these issues. And so I think you have a freedom of movement, a freedom of thought that you don't normally have. And that's not true in most of the states. Once you get out of kind of hardcore red states, the teachers unions still have everything locked down.
I mean, I think what you said actually is something we've already been seeing, and this is what I was talking about. There's already a backlash against the federal government getting involved in school choice, and it's become therefore, a much more vocal and high-profile backlash against school choice itself. And I, as somebody who doesn't like a lot of what the federal government does, I can actually empathize with people who may not like school choice, and they may have very good reasons. You know, I don't agree with them, but I can understand why people say, well, I'm worried about school choice. I think public schools kind of bring us all together. I think they're wrong, but I can certainly understand where good-hearted people think that. And I would be very upset if somebody said, well, you know, you don't really like school choice and you think it's dangerous and your state hasn't voted for it, so we're going to go to the federal government and impose it on you. Absolutely, that's what we saw in Common Core. And people, I think, a big backlash against Common Core wasn't necessarily they didn't like the standards, is they didn't like the imposition. And we make this even more dangerous when we talk about, well, let's now have something that reaches out to private schools. But the backlash part that you're talking about may be coming, it's here. We're already seeing it. And I should note that we're worried about teachers' unions. I absolutely agree that teachers' unions have a lot of power. But I can walk around the District of Columbia, and National Education Association has a massive headquarters building, I think that way. The American Federation of Teachers has a massive headquarters building, I think that way. The National Association of Secondary School Principals, the National School Board Association, they all have headquarters here. And the Department of Education was created largely because the NEA became an active union at the time in the 70s and said, we're going to endorse a political candidate or presidential candidate. And Jimmy Carter said, hey, I'll give you a Department of Education. And why do they want a federal Department of Education? Because it's a nice central way to exert some control. And so I think if we're worried about the teachers' unions, we have to be very worried about what the federal government does. It's sort of one-stop shopping. If you can go to the U.S. Department of Education, it's like, hey, let's get every private school to do the things that we want them to do.
Well, I'm Tom Gensel, Executive Director of the National School Boards Association. Thank you for the shout out.
I was going to use your name.
I appreciate that, Neil. Actually,
Where is the building? Did I point the right way?
We're over that way.
Okay.
But actually, we're very concerned about federal overreach, as I think you know. We've been active in that space. But my question actually deals with the reference to school districts as a monopoly. And I find that kind of interesting since there was never a federal mandate to create local school districts. This was done individually by each of the 50 states. They decided to create school districts. So I'm not seeing where that's a monopoly. I do have a question, though, about accountability. So the question is under a voucher issue, and I agree with Neil completely. I think whatever passes here is going to look very different a few years from now, because there's going to be more and more effort to regulate it. The question about accountability, though, is for parents making a decision. I'm certainly not standing here defending standardized testing, but the money, setting aside the tax credits, on a voucher, that money is not the parents' money, it's the taxpayers' money. It's everybody here and everybody else who's contributing. So why should that decision about accountability for schools be left solely to the parents when the decision is being funded by taxpayers?
Yeah, in my case, I'm not sitting here arguing for vouchers. I'm arguing for giving people the greater opportunity to give their own private money to private nonprofits for scholarships. So they already do it under the charitable deduction. We're trying to increase the tax incentive for that. There's no government money involved at all, and they're not taking. And what the Supreme Court ruled, whether people in the room agree with it or not, that the reason they wouldn't give standing is it was nobody else's money involved, so nobody could be harmed because it was the private individual that freely chose to give the donation that made the donation. So nobody else's money was implicated. People made the argument, tax expenditures and all that kind of stuff, and the Supreme Court ruled against that from a constitutional perspective. So to me, that debate's been already offered and decided, and so I understand your argument on the voucher side. That's one of the reasons I favor going on the tax side, is because I don't want to give people on that side of the aisle, I don't mean the political aisle, but on that side of the ledger, if you will, an easy argument to make for more regulation. And just quickly on the monopoly, if you're a parent in a neighborhood in which there are no charter school options and you personally can't afford private school, even if you want to attend there, it's a monopoly situation. You're forced to go to a public school, whether you think it's a crappy school or not. And that's true. And prior to us getting charter schools in New York State, that was true for most of the parents in New York City who lived in the neighborhoods that nobody in this room probably would freely choose to live in. And so what we're saying is there should be a lot more options. If the parent chooses the public school, God bless them. They choose a charter school, God bless them. They choose a private school, religious or not. To me, I don't know their child. I don't even know them. So I think they should make those decisions all by themselves. And I just want more and more choices, like we have in all the rest of our lives. We can choose almost everything else. So I just think parents, on the most fundamental thing, finding an education that they're comfortable with, that reflects the values of the family, is an important thing to make as widely available as possible, including all across the country. It shouldn't only be available in red states or only in states that the teachers' unions don't object to.
You know, my guess is that you're not going to have a lot to disagree with.
No, I mean, only the last part about whether or not it should be federal, which we've been over. I would actually add a little more, though, about the monopoly of a school district, which is not only can it be the only choice, but you are forced as a property owner or as a state taxpayer to fund those districts, to fund those schools. And Microsoft or any other bad monopoly that we want to think of, they can't actually make you fund them, whereas the school district can. So I'd say it's even worse than the kind of monopolies that we talk about. That said, I still also think the Constitution is extremely important, and I would much rather have local decision-making or state decision-making than some mechanism for the federal government to start making decisions for everyone.
So we've reached...
That's it. Sorry, Marty. That's it. I'm cutting you off. You're at your time.
So we need to leave time for the second panel. Contrary to what Neil suggested, I actually don't think the structure of the two debates implies a clear winner or loser to this one. In fact, I think the topics are complementary.
I do.
That's why you're changing the section.
The topics are complementary in that it's really only by thinking through the questions of what would this actually look like that you can make a fully informed decision about whether it's worth doing in the first place. So let's move on to that question of what these programs should look like if it were to be done. But before we do so, please join me in thanking our first panel.
Great. Very nicely done, gentlemen. Okay, our next panel, come on up. We did not officially put in a break here, but if you need a break, go ahead and feel free to do that while we do some switcheroo and microphone work. Until then, I'm going to do a little stand-up routine. I've been watching a lot of stand-up comedy on Netflix lately, and because I'm the host of this event, times 3, I get to say a few things about what we heard up here. I do want to point out to something that Tom Carroll said, that there is actually quite a bit of evidence that accountability has improved the public schools. And you can find some of that evidence in the latest issue of Education Next, a great article by Morgan Polikoff that goes over the evidence that really came out of the No Child Left Behind era that shows with some very rigorous studies that we have seen improvements, especially in math, especially for the lowest performing kids because of test-based accountability. And it reminds me, just the other day I was speaking to a crowd that was strongly anti-school choice. This was the Institute for Educational Leadership's Policy Fellowship Program. I was on the panel with former Secretary of Education John King, and he said very casually, all the evidence shows that school vouchers don't work. And I said, well, wait a minute. We just had this March for Science. Come on up here, guys. We just had this March for Science here in Washington. Let's look at the science. There's good social science showing that no. 14 of the 18 gold standard studies have shown positive effects for school vouchers. It is true that a couple of recent studies have shown negative effects, including one that we sponsored, Fordham sponsored in Ohio, but it's certainly not true to say that the evidence now clearly says vouchers don't work, just as it is not correct to say that the evidence shows that accountability doesn't work. I think the evidence shows that both of those, have a lot of promise, though, as with everything, there are trade-offs. Okay, I have done enough of my routine, and now we're on to the next one. So let me just introduce to you Darrell Bradford, the Executive Director of NYCAN, that is New York Can. New York can what? What can New York do?
It used to be called I Can because it was just me.
Yeah, there we go.
More people now.
And Darrell is also the Executive Vice President of 50 Can, which really at this point should be called something like 8 can.
10 can.
10 can. Are you up to 10? They got. They have cans. They have advocacy groups in 10 states, working their way towards 50 states. And, you know, Darrell has been involved in the school choice debate and school choice movement for a long time. I remember, one of my earliest memories in education reform, Darrell, is meeting you at some conference, maybe ALEC in Arizona. Does this ring a bell?
Yeah, and Scottsdale.
Yeah, Clint Bullock was doing some routine where he had on like a reggae wig. Anyways, we go way back. And yeah, Darrell's been in this a long time. And so, as discussed, this panel, it didn't assume that Neil would lose. It would just assume that most of us would ignore Neil's concerns about the Constitution and get on to the meat of saying, all right, if they're going to design this, and clearly, all the signals are that they're going to make some proposal, they being the Trump administration, our friends on Capitol Hill. How should they design this? And should it be something where the decisions, the key decisions are made in Washington about who participates, about is there accountability, about admissions requirements and all that kind of stuff, so that you can have a 50-state program, as Tom said, that could benefit everybody everywhere? Or is this something where you continue to defer to the states somehow and let the states make this decision? So Darrell, please introduce our panel and take it away.
Great. So I'm going to rename the panel too. It's got 2 names. It could be called Tom's Fantastic Victory or Neil's Failure at the Cave. It's going to be one of these for the Star Wars fans. You get down. So I'd just like to, we're going to change our format up too. We're going to do 10 and 10, and then we're just going to hop right into Q&A so we have more time to talk. I'd like to introduce my 2 fabulous panelists. To my immediate left, Darla Romfo, who is a long-time friend and is currently the president and chief operating officer of the Children's Scholarship Fund. She is a recovering attorney and Hill staffer for Senator Kent Conrad from North Dakota. And then my man over here, Travis Pillow, who I like to call Professor Pillow. He's not a professor, but he likes that I call him Professor Pillow, because then people call him Professor Pillow afterwards. He's the editor of Redefine Ed, which is a fabulous blog out of Florida. I'm sure most of you know it or have read it. He spent his early professional career reporting on state government and for a variety of news organizations in Florida, and he's currently part of Team Step Up for Students. So can we get a quick round of applause for our people? Darla, please kick it off.
Hey, I'm so happy to be up here with you because it takes all the pressure off to say anything funny, because he soaks up all the funny in that we need. So I think Travis and I actually agree on more things than we disagree on, but I hope that our discussion will advance the ball and help get us to a place where there's more educational opportunity for children. You heard parents and children mentioned a lot in the last discussion, but from the perspective that I have, that's really the driving force in all of this, is the parents and the children. I believe strongly that anything that empowers more parents with the resources and the knowledge to make the best decisions for their children is something we should seriously consider. I believe parents are the first educators of their children, and I think that gets lost in a lot of the discussions. You know, God gives children to parents. He doesn't give them to systems or schools, so we got to get back to that basic, accepting that basic premise that that's a values-based decision. Who is really responsible for a child's education? It's the parent. So I think a federal tax credit actually does move the ball forward and advance that particular objective. But I think that requiring states to opt in could needlessly put up a barrier for a lot of parents who are in situations where they very, very badly, Tom mentioned it, for a lot of parents, the only option is a school that they're zoned to go to, and that's it. And a parent is sitting there. I've seen so many. It's not a fake story. It's real news. Mothers cry when they have to send their child to a failing school. I would want to recognize that I think that all tax credits, by their very nature, are opt-in. Nobody's going to hold a gun to a taxpayer's head and say you have to use this tax credit. You have to donate to a scholarship granting organization. And on the level of a scholarship, nobody points the gun at the head of a parent and says you have to apply for a scholarship. It's all opt-in. And I think for those that are worried about you're abdicating control from putting it from the federal, from the state government up to federal government, I'm trying to think about. I know it's possible, but like Tom said, I think the worst things can happen anyway. So I think there's a lot of things we can do, and a lot of ways we can prevent that. And you look at the charitable deduction now, it doesn't, because taxpayers give to organizations that work in the area of education, the federal government doesn't put any onerous requirements on those scholarship granting organizations, of which I run one, or on other organizations as well. The state and local governments can be in control of the same particulars that they're in control of now. I would actually argue that this moves towards putting control at the most local level possible, and that's in the hands of the parents. And if you build up a constituency of parents all around the country who are becoming much more knowledgeable, empowered to make decisions for their parents, I would say that's a very, very powerful constituency. We've seen it in Florida. We've seen that the parents turn out in droves because they suddenly, I see it with the parents that we serve. Something wakes up inside of them. Parents basically want to do the best thing for their child. And when they're given the opportunity to do it, something comes alive in them. And they can talk about this. You should have a parent up here making this case, because when they get up there and talk about what makes the most sense for their children, they can do a far better job than I could do. I would also say that a tax credit can be viewed as an enhancement of the current charitable deduction. Right now in a state like New Jersey does not allow a deduction against your New Jersey income taxes for a donation to a scholarship granting organization. So in a state like New Jersey right now, we have a partner in New Jersey, the Tri-County Scholarship Program. If people want to donate to that program, they only take a federal deduction. They don't take a state deduction. Now, the program operates in New Jersey under New Jersey law. It's a New Jersey not-for-profit, but they raise money completely under the federal tax deduction. So if suddenly Tri-County starts to raise money under the tax credit, what's going to change? The kids are going to go to the same schools. Hopefully they'll just be able to raise more money and help more kids. So I don't think that it's a good precedent to start when you're setting up a tax credit, if we get so lucky that that actually happens, that suddenly you're saying you prefer one state over another, especially when it's a tax credit that benefits families and children who are so in desperate need of other alternatives. And one final point that I'd like to make is that CSF in its early days, we were started in 1999. We were giving away 40,000 four-year scholarships. Here we are still today giving away scholarships because unfortunately the world hasn't changed as much as my two co-founders thought that it would. But we had 1,250,000 applications for 40,000 scholarships. We had applications from all 50 states. We had applications from 90% of the counties in America. In some states, we had in some places like New York City, we had 30% of the eligible population apply for a scholarship. So there's no question that there's a demand for this. Now, state by state, that was talked about a little bit. School choice has been expanding, and I think it's great that there are 430,000 kids that are getting vouchers or tax credit scholarships in 17 states across the country. But that has taken over 20 years to get to that place. And I come back to the parents. Put yourself in the shoes of a parent. You know that if your child, we all know the statistics, if your child doesn't learn to read by the time they're in 3rd grade, their prospects get so much dimmer going into the future. And I think we need to really keep doing that as you're having this discussion. Maybe everything about how to do this isn't perfect, but put yourself in the shoes of a parent who is getting up every day, and that the hopeless sense of sending my kid to a school where they're not going to learn, they might not be safe, it doesn't express my values. There's just the host of things, and not having a choice. Not very many people in this room don't have choices. Most of us can figure out how to get the best thing for our health, for our education, for our children's education. We have resources. I'm telling you that there are a lot of parents, and I see them every day, and I'm astonished by how grateful they are for our scholarship, which, by the way, is only a maximum of $3,100. They are so grateful. They have to pay part of the tuition, and yet they are so incredibly grateful. I just think, could this gratitude be real? Because it doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal. But for a mother or a father or a grandparent, whomever is in the role of trying to provide for that child, it is a huge deal. and I look at states like New York or California or Illinois, they're not likely to pass school choice anytime soon. Yet in just the 3 cities of New York City, Chicago, and Los Angeles, I think there are over 2 million school-age children. In the country, there are 56 million school-age children. If we're looking at this $20 billion potential plan, if you did a $6,000 scholarship, I think you only get to about 3 million children that you're actually helping. If we're thinking that that's some potential for huge federal overreach, I just don't see it. But for the kids that could be helped, it's really a huge thing, because there are no do-overs when it comes to your education. You get, you know, we sit here and talk about what could happen in this number of years. 12 years, you know, that's a lifetime in an education. I want to close my comments by asking you to put yourself in the shoes of a mother. I want to give voice to a mother. Her name is Sarah, and she has 2 children, Farida and Fawzain. I actually had a chance to spend several hours in a car when we went up to Albany last year, and she watched the government at work. She was helping us talk about the tax credit in New York, and we had a long time to talk. And what she's forever in my soul. She's forever a part of me. Her story is amazing. She's got 2 children. Farida is now in 5th grade at St. Charles Borromeo School. Her son is a sophomore in high school at St. Raymond's High School. She came here from Togo in West Africa in 2003, and Farida was the first child to be in the family to be born in the U.S. She went to a public school at first, and she was in shock and horror because she thought, this can't be America. This can't be how they do things. She found out through people in her community that there are other alternatives. There are private schools, but you have to get a scholarship because you're not going to be able to probably afford it. She's adamant that her children receive a good education, and she's happy now that she has a scholarship. And this is Sarah in her own words. Education is very important. I look at my life, and I see that education is everything. When you have a diploma, no matter how long it takes to get it, it makes you able to live your life. It's a struggle if you don't have a good education. I am struggling. It is a sacrifice to send my kids to school. In Togo, I didn't go to college. I got my GED in 2011 and started classes at LaGuardia Community College to become an LPN. Hopefully I can finish soon. In the meantime, she's one of those moms who is so thankful for the scholarship. I mean, she spent time in and out of a homeless shelter in this whole process, but in all of this, the scholarship has provided stability and hope. Her kids are thriving academically. They're looking forward to going to college. And she says, I'm so grateful that people care and that there are scholarships for families like mine. So I say, whatever our differences are, if you can think of a better way to get more help to more people more quickly, I'm all ears for it. But I want to help people like Sarah now, because if she hadn't gotten scholarships, she would have been in that school that horrified her when she came to this country. I'd end by saying, you know, one person with a belief is equal to 99 people who have an interest in something. I think there are a lot of people who believe that we have to do more for these families. We're failing them. So let's get together behind a belief and let's do something to help these families.
Strong opening gambit from Darla. Travis, your turn.
Okay, so it's great to, I guess, leave behind the swamp of Florida and join you all in the swamp of DC. Washington, D.C. And I come from Florida, where we are home to what is currently the largest private school choice program in the nation. We have 98,000 children in Florida this school year using tax credit scholarships to attend private school of their choice. They are, the typical recipient of one of our scholarships is a single mother who earns less than $25,000 a year. In addition to being the largest tax credit scholarship program in the nation, we are also certainly among the most heavily regulated, but we are still far less regulated than your typical voucher program. And so I think that having that good balance of regulations has given policymakers in Florida the confidence to allow our program to continue to grow. And so basically, as long as demand for scholarships continues to come pretty close to exhausting the supply, our program is able to grow year after year in the statute automatically without any politician taking action. And what that means is that Florida is now the 800-pound gorilla in the tax credit scholarship universe. We account for basically 1 out of every $2 that goes to tax credit scholarship programs nationally, and we account for basically 1 out of every 3 students served. And where I agree with Darla 100% is I don't want that to remain true for long. I want there to be efforts in New York, in Chicago, in California, even in Texas, where rural Republicans have stonewalled school choice, that are able to rival or at least eclipse what we're able to do in Florida. I think that it's worth teasing out, though, a couple points about why it might be best for a national initiative to really be driven by the states. And part of that is that, you know, Neil felt that the deck was stacked against him here, but I think that in Congress, the deck might be stacked against in his favor, because you know, the default assumption is that just Congress isn't going to do something. There's a lot of reasons for them not to do it. And so what I would propose is that we would want to create a state-driven program where the feds are really enacting a tax policy. They're enacting a federal tax credit that would allow individuals or companies to receive a dollar-for-dollar offset on their tax liability to contribute to a program like ours in Florida or like Children's Scholarship Fund in New York. And that the states would then control those programs, and they would govern those programs. And they would have to meet certain minimum qualifications. I think that the approach would have a better chance of passing muster with people like Freedom Caucus Republicans, who might believe in school choice, but might strongly feel that Congress has no business getting directly involved in how school choice programs should be pursued. But I would also argue that a state-driven approach, where states are really setting the parameters around their own programs, could have the potential to win support on the Democratic side of the aisle as well. And I'll just share an anecdote from Florida that I think illustrates that. In 2014, we were working on a bill in the legislature that would have that enabled more working class and middle class families to qualify for scholarship funding. But we had a Democratic state senator, his name was Darren Soto from Orlando, who was very adamant that we needed to, if we were going to expand our scholarship program into the higher income levels, to put the most disadvantaged families at the front of the line. And so he basically insisted on a provision that ensures that the lowest income families are the first to qualify for scholarships, and that the higher income families can only receive scholarships once all those families have been served. I think the program is better off because he advocated for that change, but also he wound up ultimately supporting our bill and supporting private school choice. And in 2016, he was just elected to Congress. And so I think that if you allow states to design their own programs and to figure out how we're going to treat the most disadvantaged families, or whether we're going to also serve the middle class or working class families, and how that's going to be structured, you might be able to get some Darren Soto type Democrats on board in Congress as well, and then in state houses around the country. I think that one way that I like to think about this is in terms of Medicaid expansion under Obamacare. You saw that it really changed the political calculus for governors around the country, including Republican governors, where you convinced people like John Kasich in Ohio to participate in this new federal initiative to expand healthcare coverage to their citizens. I think that when you're talking about a federal tax credit, the most potent argument that our opponents are able to raise against these kind of programs is that they're diverting money from the state treasury that could otherwise be going to public schools. That is a politically potent argument that they like to make. But when you're talking about a federal tax credit, that argument starts to go away. And so you might be looking at a very different political calculus in some of these states. And then, to piggyback on something Darla was saying, once you have these families that are participating in this program and beginning to benefit from it, you have an army of advocates. We have seen how this has changed things that parents do in their own life. We have seen parents who will receive a scholarship for their child, and then they themselves will go on back to college or go back to school and pursue their own education. But we've also seen them begin to realize that they matter in the political process and that politicians will listen to them. And we've seen parents come and testify before the legislature and seen legislators actually change their votes based on, right there in the room, based on what those parents said. And those parents start to feel that they have power, and a lot of people don't necessarily feel that way in our politics. And so once you have that constituency, it becomes easier to start to grow these programs and to start to advocate for these programs to grow in our states, and it becomes harder and harder to dismantle them. You don't hear, once a program has been created, about voucher programs being dismantled, about tax credits getting taken away. It doesn't happen, in part because no one wants to uproot these families. And these families would also form a bulwark against some of the excessive regulation that I think Neil was concerned about. And so I just hope that Congress will take advantage of this unprecedented opportunity to start building this 50-state constituency for school choice, or at least to plant the seeds that will enable it to flourish in the states. And I would say that I believe so strongly in that I would look at a different part of Obamacare as a potential model for this, which is the health exchanges, where you had states that were able to structure their own programs, design their own programs, and run their own programs. But if the states failed to act, then the federal government stepped in, and the federal government then administered something. And so I think having that kind of a backstop would even be appropriate. We could allow states to be the laboratories of democracy, allow states to experiment with how to best run private school choice programs, but then ultimately ensure that we do create a 50-state constituency to advocate for new education options for the disadvantaged.
Okay, panel's over. No,
we agree.
Yeah, so a bunch of complicated questions. I think first I want to talk about the politics of this, and then I'd like to get a little bit into this regulatory piece, which I think you just hopped on something I think is very important. So part of why Florida has such great bipartisan support now is because it passed a program when it was like red top to bottom. So if the country were a legislature, right now we have like very few Democrats because they're all in like the Northeast, California, you know, whatever, that kind of thing. So how do you deal with building sort of Democratic support if ostensibly no Democratic states would opt in? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, so first of all, this gets to exactly what Tom was saying earlier, that you have red top to bottom at the federal level. And that might be necessary initially to get past the teachers union. But what we're seeing in Florida, you know, we had a private school choice bill last week that passed unanimously with support from Democrats who argued in favor of it even. And so what starts to happen is these Democratic legislators will see in their communities families that are benefiting from this. They'll see in their communities educators who are using these programs in their own schools. You'll see maybe private schools starting up that are serving the disadvantaged for the first time. Legislators will see that, they'll wake up to that, and they'll begin to realize, you know what, this is something that's worth doing, this is something that is helping my constituents, and then also that constituency of parents and educators who are tied to this school choice program becomes a sort of counterweight to the teachers union. And so what I'm hoping we can see is Republican politicians at the federal level sort of plant the seeds for bipartisan coalitions in the state level.
So I mean, I
have a question for him, actually. I want to understand in the opt-in after the states, because I think there are some states that would never opt into this in a million years. So how long do you give them to opt in before there's this federal backstop?
That's a good question, but I would say you wouldn't want to give them enough time to you wouldn't want to give them enough time for Congress to retreat from this initiative. Like, okay. I think you wouldn't want to let this window of opportunity close.
So you like the idea of saying, like, if you don't want to do it, we're going to do it for you, but you get a first chance to do it. So just an interesting question on this. So I work in New York, New Jersey. You're in Florida. How is this any different than charter schools, basically, which both have state, initiatives, state funding streams, and one at the federal level that have conspired to sort of give us lots of differentiation, lots of choice in places we didn't have it before.
Well, charter schools are public schools. This is funding to go to private schools, and I think we have to step back for a minute and kind of make that values-based decision again. What kind of a school system? How do we want to educate our kids in this country? It's not. I don't think there's anything. We're already assuming that by talking about public schools and charter schools that there's something unique or special or better, or that's the public system has some mystique about it. I think that you have to step back and say, why can't we have really a pluralism of schools, all different kinds of schools, and that there's something good about private schools just by their virtue of their very existence. And parents obviously want to choose them. I mean, the fact that poor parents pay tuition to go to private schools is nothing short of astonishing. I actually worked for Senator Breaux, too, on Capitol Hill, so I had a long history working for Democrats. And when I first came to work at CSF, I thought, really, we're going to have poor parents pay part of this? That's so counterintuitive to me. But then as I observed and actually talked to people in the private school system and heard no, you would never want parents to not pay something, because we have a culture that is created around the fact that our parents own the education. And we have to come back to thinking about that again. Is that something that's fundamentally wrong with our system, is that parents don't own it? So how can we do the things? One of the things we saw about CSF when we learned about CSF was that it had a family effect. It didn't just have an effect on the child. It didn't just have an effect on the school. It had a family effect. Like I said before, it woke something up in a family. I think that there's no amount of dollars, there's no amount of policy, there's nothing that can take the place of the fact that people from the ground up need to hold their children and their schools accountable. There's no government program that can ever take the place of that. And if we can use a little bit of money to get a lot of leverage, to get more and more people bought into that idea and awakened to that idea, and again, I look at everybody in this room. Your schools probably work for your kids a large part because you make them work, because you're on top of it. The people that we're talking about, they feel hopeless. They don't feel like there's any point in getting on top of because there's nothing they can do. But if you empower them, and I think that's as important as anything. You can talk about the mechanics of it. You can talk about how it should be, whether it should be. But I think the overriding thing that goes above and beyond everything else we've talked about is how do you get more people at the bottom of this situation engaged and empowered and with hope. I mean, hope, what is hope? But you know what? If you don't have it, Barack Obama won the presidency on hope. So obviously it's a pretty important thing that speaks deeply to every one of us. And how do you awaken that in an individual who feels like they don't have any, especially when it comes to their child who they love more than anything in the world? I think that's like an overarching thing that we need to step back, talk about, and think about a lot, because it means as much as any of the mechanics to any of this.
So this question of scale, I think, is a really important one. So Travis, you referenced healthcare a couple of times. I think it's like whether or not you support healthcare or not, it was so sweeping that now it can't be undone. Doesn't the scale of something like that actually argue for a 50-state approach that just gives it to everybody right away, instead of sort of trying to wade through it and maybe have it waylaid, or making it tougher to get more people to get the benefit of a tax credit?
Well, I mean, I think that there can be virtues in programs growing over time, gradually. Especially, I mean, that's the way it worked in Florida. I mean, there was a time when we were basically an offshoot of the Children's Scholarship Fund that was only serving a few thousand students, and it took a while to grow, and to grow responsibly, because if we're talking about a game-changing program, I don't know that there can be some virtues in having some level of gradual growth, but I would say that we are talking about. So yeah, I mean, but I think that achieving scale should be an important goal and something we should shoot for right out.
What are your thoughts on the intersection of sort of accountability, test-based or otherwise, and private school identity? Like, what line in the sand do we draw? Should we ask to be drawn in exchange for the tax credit and more educational freedom?
I'll let him take the first crack at it.
So the beauty of a tax credit scholarship, in my view, is that you have several different forms of accountability. First, you have what I would call donor accountability, where under the Florida model, and presumably under any federal model, you have donors who are giving money to these scholarship funds. They don't have to do that. It's voluntary. And so when you have donors contributing to these funds, they're going to want to know a couple things. First of all, they're going to want to know that we're not going to embarrass them. You know, they're going to want to know that there's not going to be scandals or misappropriations of funds. Then they're also going to want to know, is there actually going to be student learning taking place? Is the program being evaluated? Does it show that the children are making academic progress? And in Florida, we have studies that show that they are in fact making academic progress commensurate to their peers in public schools. And then these donors are also going to want to know, the C-suite type of people that are making these decisions about whether a company should contribute to a scholarship fund. They're going to want to know, is their money being used efficiently? And so the fact that our organization doles out 97% of its money to scholarship goes a long way with those people. Then you have the level of parental accountability, where you have parents holding schools accountable to whether or not their own child is learning and their own child is being well served. And so I would say that to have the donor accountability and the parent accountability work, you need a certain modicum of transparency. You're going to need probably some financial audits on the people who are funding these scholarships to ensure that there's clarity over how the money's being spent. And you're also going to need to have some level of academic testing to ensure that the children are making academic progress. But then beyond that...
State tests, nationally normed. You want to prescribe something? You want to leave it up to people?
I would say that that's the beauty of a 50-state approach. We haven't really figured out the exact best way to do that, and I would love to see more experimentation on those kinds of questions.
Darla?
Well, I would just say that when you run a not-for-profit of any kind right now under current law, there's something called good governance. And every partner program that we're affiliated with right now, we ask for their audited financial statements. We want to know if they have a conflict of interest policy. We want to know if they have a whistleblower policy. I don't think that's asking too much of anybody, and I think if you're somebody who runs an organization, you should be learning on a continuing basis what are the newest and best practices in terms of good governance for your organization. So I think imposing that level of governance requirements on an organization that's participating, I don't think that that's onerous or troubling in any kind of a way. Where I do think you could get, have difficulties if you start to impose things on private schools about what they have to teach, or how they have to do things.
Such as?
Well, religious liberties, such as the transgender bathroom issue, for example, or marriages between a man and a woman, or whatever it is that the religious school might have, because a lot of our kids go to religious schools. Now, I don't think that this tax credit is going to be the door through which those kinds of things happen. I unfortunately don't think the cultural winds are really at the back of a lot of the people that believe and practice and think in these kinds of ways. So I think if this is a concern, you're going to have to be concerned about it on all different kinds of levels. And right now, as somebody noted earlier, private schools get federal money. I don't see why it wouldn't have been possible under the prior administration, or if it would have happened if we had a different president now, or if it's going to happen in the future, why there wouldn't have been strings attached to requirements made on those schools that get Title I money. If you really, if you're really that strict on that issue, I think you should be figuring out a way right now for every religious institution, school, church, whatever, to be able to get along without 501c3 funding. Seriously, if that's how you want to think about the future and look at the future. So I would actually argue that you build a constituency. The more people that are involved in and go to religious schools or are able to practice their faith freely, or even start to think about these things, you have a bigger constituency of people that are awakened to the fact that we need to be vigilant about protecting these things if they're important to us.
So I think this is a good segue. So I was not always like sort of a universalist. I may not quite be a universalist now, but I'm definitely a fan of raising income limits precisely because of this political constituency problem. Thoughts on this, like low-income kids first, exclusively, like working-class families included, yes, no, why?
Well, because of the constituents we serve, and because I see how underserved they still are. And I can't even imagine that there would be a program that would be big enough that we could go beyond helping low-income people. I think there should be, every parent everywhere should have the ability to use whatever resources are available to send a kid to any school that they want to go to. But I have to start with the poorest of our children, who actually are the most likely to be in an underserved situation where they're going to a zone school that's failing them. So I would start with that. Like I said, I can't even, to have a situation where could be big enough to expand to a larger group of people that's a good problem to have.
Sure, Travis?
I'm on the same page. I think that the low income and the disadvantaged need to be our priority. And a lot of people talk about needing to build a strong political constituency, but I would say that we've seen in Florida how those low-income families can form the base of a very powerful political constituency, and one that maybe they wind up maybe even surprising themselves how much impact they can have on the politics of their issue. I would also say, though, that there are working class and middle class families where they do struggle to afford tuition. And so I would definitely agree that the low-income family should be a priority. But then once they are all served, there is a question of closing the affordability gap for other families, because the ultimate goal should be to create choices for everyone who doesn't currently have them.
So I have one more question, and we're going to open it up to the audience. Should kids already enrolled in private school be able to participate in the tax credit program, no matter who runs it?
Again, well, from my perspective, you know, again, I think there are so many kids that still are sitting in failing seats that someone who's already in a private school seat is showing that they've found some way to get there and found some way to make that possible for them. Again, there's so many people that are still in New York City, or in New York State, for example, by Governor Cuomo's own study, there were 250,000 kids in the last 10 years who've gone through schools that are persistently failing. And that's by the state standard of what a failing school is. I mean, the amount of money it would take to help those 250,000 kids and keep that from repeating itself, those are kids that are sitting in failing seats. I want to help them first.
Travis?
Agreed. I would also say, though, that this is a good example of the kind of thing that maybe would be best to leave the states to sort of referee those debates, and then have some transparency around who's actually being served by these programs, so we can start to see you know, how these programs can serve different groups effectively, and are they really putting the needs of the disadvantaged first. I mean, I would say that you might have a family of say a teacher and a firefighter that together are earning $70,000 a year or something like that, that might be scrimping and saving to get their kids into private school, that might benefit from a partial scholarship. But then you also have, you know, again, our typical family, a low-income single mother who has a greater need for a scholarship. So there is a question of priority. There is also a question of maybe you do want to start helping some families who are higher up the income ladder, but there should be transparency around who's getting served.
And let's remember, in a place like New York, 70,000 in income is actually like low income.
Yeah,
So it's not, and I would just want to add that, I mean, I'm for a system that actually where we have a plurality of schools, and everyone should be able to choose any school that they want to go to. So, but I'm saying when you're setting priorities, I mean, you start with, generally in our society, that's how we start helping, is from the bottom up. So.
Okay. The later debate will be about the value of having middle-class people in your coalition. You're an insider. You come later. Over there in the corner, please.
Well, that's bias from the chair.
I know it is. And to echo Marty in the form of a question, please. Thank you.
Okay. Mel Klein, Accuracy in Academia. Really impressed with everything all of you have done, but I have to ask, since Medicaid is bankrupting the states and half the health exchanges crashed in the middle of last year, are you sure you want to use Obamacare as a reference point?
Wait, let me answer that one. Not on the exchange thing. I'm only using it as a point about adoption. So even people who ran against repealing it showed up at town hall meetings, and suddenly people had health care, and they were like, "You're not taking this from me." So I think there's a valuable lesson there. Sorry, good, Travis.
I think Darrell fell on that grenade heroically.
Thank you.
Said everything that I would say.
Right here, front row.
Hi, my name is Leo Doran. I'm a reporter for Inside Sources. I cover education. I thought the point about bringing in liberals was interesting, to get them to support some of these initiatives. It seems like this could be a double-edged sword, in particular with the confirmation hearings. You heard about how there's kind of the concern among rural conservatives who seem susceptible to this argument that increasing choice could weaken their schools. So I'm interested to hear whether you think that's whether there's a chance that rural conservatives could upend these efforts politically, and if so, how would you frame the argument to them?
So first of all, I think that we can say definitively that rural conservatives have been a major roadblock to many of the efforts in the states. If you look at what's happened in Arkansas in the legislature this past year, if you look at what's happened in Texas, rural Republicans are a big barrier to the advancement of the school choice movement at the state level right now. I would say, though, that if you look at our experience in Florida, some of our highest participation, highest density counties for scholarship participation are your rural areas where you have a significant number of low-income families, and you have maybe not a lot of options in those communities because you don't have a charter school, for example. You don't have magnet schools or other sort of choices available to those families. Private schools, though, exist in 65 of Florida's 67 counties. And so if you want to expand school choice and educational options in rural communities, really private schools are probably the most readily available way to do that. The second thing is there is a lot of concern about the fiscal impact, and I think that, and that can be an issue. I would say that what we've seen again in Florida is that our scholarship programs ultimately generate a fiscal savings for the state because the per pupil funding is less than what the state would be spending on public schools.
And that was a government report, not your report.
That was government reports, nonprofit reports. Has been looked at 7 different ways by 7 different.
It's a softball, Travis.
Yes. You're a great wingman.
Thank you.
But so we don't really the two main arguments against rural school choice programs are, number one, that there aren't really options for families. I would say that we need more, but private schools are a great way to go. And then number two, that you're draining resources from public schools. First of all, those two arguments are mutually exclusive. If no one's leaving for other options, you're not going to see. So pick one. But second of all, I think that the experience in Florida bears out that both of those don't really hold water in practice.
I'm Jenny Gentles. I'm working with American Federation for Children. On the rural school issue, AFC has figured out how to map private schools. So if anyone is interested in seeing visually that there are private schools spread across rural areas, let us know and we can send you a map. I did want to have a discussion or hear from you all about spreading your models. Years ago, I ran a school choice program in Ontario and came to New York's Children's Scholarship Fund and got your database and learned how to run our scholarship program based on the CSF model. And then I know that in Florida, you all, I think, have helped Alabama set up their program. From an implementation standpoint, what would that look like if all of a sudden students in other states needed access to scholarships and there were people interested in setting up scholarship granting organizations in these new places? What would that process be, and would your organizations be able to help with that?
Darla, you run multiple state organizations.
Well, we actually have partner programs around the country that they're their own separate 501c3s, but we have some of them right now that are expanding into other states and going to other cities, and we've actually developed databases together that we share. We basically can take a package and give it to somebody to work with, and they can get it started and up and running in a very short amount of time. It's not real, and we have partner programs in 17 states right now, and most of those are states that currently don't have. Only a couple of them actually have any kind of publicly funded choice right now. So it would be coverage in some of those 25 states that don't have any kind of choice right now. So they would be equipped and ready to expand and go statewide. And when we first ran scholarships, we had a national pool of scholarships because remember we had the scholarship applications from 90% of the counties around the country. So in places where there wasn't somebody who wanted to take local ownership and start a scholarship organization, we ran a whole pool of national. So I don't see that as being a barrier to this happening.
I had a question for Travis on the state role in this. So Congress passes a bill, sweetens the donation incentive, turns it from a deduction to a credit, to a 501c3 entity that does scholarship, hands out scholarships. Why does the state have to do anything? Or why would the state have to do anything? Right? Congress passes a bill. I mean, you have a tax deduction now, turns it into a credit. Why would the state have to have a role at all? What would really change other than the incentive is higher to go to existing organizations that get it now and would likely spring up new ones like was just mentioned. Are you suggesting, say, on the Medicaid model, that a state actually has to pass a law to make a federal tax change effective in the state? I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, so the way that the state revenue would flow would be into a scholarship granting organization that would have to be qualified. And so there would be, I guess, potentially two paths to qualify. The first path would be through an existing state-created program, And then the second path to qualify would be through the federal backstop program.
So New York could still say, nah, we don't want to do it now. We don't want to do it after Congress passes a bill.
To follow my exchange analogy, that would be how it would work.
In other words, forget about it. Over there in the corner.
But I would say that there would be also an incentive for maybe New York to maybe take some initiative. If it doesn't want to have this imposed on it by the feds, there might be an incentive for New York to take an initiative and design its own program.
What incentive would that be?
If you want to dictate how the policy is structured
Yeah,
in your state.
I think you were offering that if the state did not set up one, the
Then the
federal
federal
one would happen automatically.
Right.
But wouldn't that happen right out of the gate, though? Congress passes a law.
Well, that's why I was asking him how much time would he wait, and he said not very long. Because of the states that have no laws right now, yeah, but the states that have no school choice provisions right now, that's half of the 56 million school-age children, so that would be a lot of children that would be excluded from this opportunity.
And we do not want to exclude them.
Right. That we agree on.
So in terms of improving schools in general and improving education for all, obviously giving these tax credits and giving these scholarships to students would just increase the demand at the top, you know, let's say 25% of schools in whichever area. What happens to the students who aren't able to get into those schools? They're obviously going to be going to the schools that are already not doing as well. So how does it how does it improve the system as a whole? I guess I'm trying to get at the end goal of that.
Well, the end goal is not improving systems. The end goal is actually empowering parents, and I'm going back to my original point, which was that there's not enough accountability. I think we think too much about systems, and we don't think enough about the people that are in the systems, and that's the kids. And if a parent makes the choice that they want to go, you said the top 25% of schools, and you're just assuming that everything that's not in the top 25% isn't worth attending. But parents make decisions that those schools are worth attending. And I've been to a lot of those schools, and you know, from the first time I walked into one of those schools, I was shocked and amazed. I thought, wow, this is a place, I've never gone into one where I don't say, this is a place where I wouldn't mind coming every day. So I think we can't, you know, don't make assumptions about what works for a particular parent in a particular situation, because there's no way it is possible for us to know all the variables in their life and why they make the decisions that they do. And I have a great amount of faith that's grown greater over the last 20 years about a parent's ability to make the best decision for their kid if they are given the right resources to do it. So I'm not going to agree with your premise at the beginning and say, you know, I don't think that's not my goal in all of this.
I would just also say that once parents have more options, you do start to see systemic improvement on several different fronts. We have research in Florida that says that the impact of introducing our program on public school achievement is positive. The competitive gains are small, but you still see public schools getting better and getting better academic results when they're under competitive pressure from our program, not worse. And then second of all, you do see new people coming in or existing organizations expanding the available private school options to meet this demand. So we have a new, Cristo Rey Catholic High School that just opened in Tampa in my neck of the woods. We have, a variety of different organizations either looking at Florida or actively growing their options in Florida to meet the new demand from these low-income families who didn't have this option available.
And I would add to that Florida is one of few states that does have this tax credits or the vouchers where it is a big enough program where you can attract innovators and new schools and expand existing schools. Most of the programs they're not quite big enough to, well, they're not even nearly big enough to do that. So you're filling empty seats in schools, which is a good thing and a positive thing. But I think it would be great to have something that was big enough that you could attract innovative new ideas the way you have in the charter school sector. It takes a certain amount of money to do that, and the $6,000, which I think your scholarship is just barely enough to do that in Florida. And think about that for a minute. $6,000 to be able to attract an innovative new private school model. Where do you hear that happening? You don't hear it in the charter sector even, which I applaud charters. I'm so glad they exist. But I mean, to be able to do that, get that kind of innovation at that kind of a price tag, that's pretty incredible.
Yeah, I want to triple down on this, and then I think you're going to be our last question. You got to price it right. So I think one of the things we've seen in the charter school space is the ability to replicate because the price point is higher, or the ability to try new things. And one of the kind of fundamental premises, I think, of tax credits and vouchers and other things that let people go to private schools is that we could do it for less. And so that has been that's tamped down on innovation. It's made it more difficult to make more than the top 25% or to make the top 25% hold more students. You will get our final question.
Well, thank you. I'm Catherine Clark with the American Speech Language Hearing Association. And I'd just like to know, how would you address the needs of students with disabilities in an expanded school choice program? What your thoughts are? What has been some of your experiences in Florida? If you could share that.
Good question.
Yes, great question, because I think that this is an area where we need probably some more creative thinking. But in Florida right now, our tax credit scholarship program is the largest of our programs, but we actually have 2 other private school choice programs that are specifically targeted at children with special needs. We have the McKay scholarship program, which is more of a voucher, and we have the Gardner scholarship program, which is more of an education savings account, and which is currently available mostly to children with more severe sets of special needs. I think that a lot of times you need special programs to cater to those students because their needs tend to be greater. They just need more support. And our $6,000 scholarship, by and large, is not going to afford a parent the ability to get that extra support that their child's going to need. And so you either need to figure out a sort of a weighting mechanism to get those families the funding they need to get the resources they need, or you're going to need to figure out how to create a separate program. I would also say that the idea of an education savings account where you're able to sort of shop around for options outside of beyond just school choice, but being able to also pay for therapists and curriculum and other sorts of things, really is an excellent fit for the special needs community, because those children's needs are so much more diverse and so much more multifaceted.
Yeah, 2 points on this. I would say, one, I think this argues for like even more funding portability. So if you like, part of the reason why it's difficult to offer this full suite of services is, to my point before, it's like the tax credit is $6,000. It's just not enough. But if the state would fund a student at 80, I think that puts something different on the table. The second thing is sort of like a more interesting thing. We sort of discovered this when I was working in the tax credit hell of New Jersey. Is that if you've been there, you understand this. Is that some parents are actually willing to sort of trade off environment for service. So they don't necessarily need they don't want 1 to 100 that the district can make available. They do want 1 to 20 that a local school can make available, plus other concessions about the environment of the school, like nurturing, mission, a bunch of other things. There's like a charter school special education collaborative that does some stuff about this in New York, and that's one of the things I sort of found out. So I'd like to thank the Thomas P. Fordham Institute and the Hoover Institute. You can thank them too, and our panelists.
And the audience.
And the audience.